Welcome to Clarity in a Messy World, the podcast that looks at the causes behind the most confounding issues of our time. I'm David Wayne Callahan. In every episode, I'll be speaking with experts who will share their knowledge and insights and help us to untangle a seemingly chaotic world. Clarity in a Messy World is a production of Bocconi University, Milan, in collaboration with the Bocconi Student Media Center. This episode might feel somewhat personal to you. After all, as a podcast listener, you're a believer in the power of voice, and you're not alone. Lately, voice has been a hot topic. Think of Clubhouse or Alexa. Voice seems to be a natural and pleasant way for us humans to access information. But is it effective? And can it give us something that images or text just don't? Joining us today is Professor Kurt Munz. Kurt is an assistant professor of marketing at Bocconi University in Milan. He earned his PhD in marketing from the NYU Stern School of Business. He takes an experimental approach to research in consumer behavior and often focuses on the influence of new technologies on consumer judgment and decision-making. What compelled us to host him here is his research on auditory information processing. Kurt, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's a real pleasure.
Kurt, in preparing this episode, you told me that your interest in auditory information processing dates back to your days as a naval officer in the U.S. Can you explain that for us?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So prior to academia, I served as an officer on surface ships in the United States Navy. One of the watches that I stood in this role involved the coordination of movements of aircraft, as well as speaking to various members of a watch team within the ship. And so in order to stand this watch, the Navy provided me with a headset. And this was the state-of-the-art technology in headsets. It could cover 4 audio channels at the same time. And each of these 4 audio channels would mean like a different circuit. So on one of these audio channels, I was talking to people in next to me in house. And other circuits, I was monitoring for airplane chatter. And then other channels, you could also communicate. So you could talk over these channels. And what really struck me about this particular headset with these 4 auditory channels in my head all at the same time was what a complicated task this was. It was very difficult to process the information from all these different sources, as well as do my watchstanding duties while trying to process all of this information. And so this is one of the things that motivated my research into trying to understand how this emerging idea of voice commerce, so transacting over voice, and maybe over an Amazon Alexa or a Google Assistant to make purchases. To try to understand this new phenomenon, I began from this idea of the difficulty that I had when I was in the Navy trying to process all of this auditory information. And so in my research, I really wanted to understand what were the drivers of this difficulty, and are there things we can do to make it easier for consumers to use these technologies?
One can get the sensation that we're living in a golden age for the voice. Podcast popularity is on the rise. The market for voice assistants such as Alexa is exploding, and a social media platform such as Clubhouse is marketed as the next big thing. Why now?
I think the answers might also be related to different for these different media. Mm-hmm. And I think just looking at it from a societal perspective, the way we're consuming media in general is changing. So if you can think of it, we're sort of in an age of Netflix, whereas before we were in the age of linear programming. So the difference here is that with linear programming, you would tune into a channel, you would tune into the radio, you would tune into your television, and whatever was on was what you were going to watch, or you could change the channel. Instead, today, we have menus of a la carte content. So for television consumption, that's Netflix. You just choose what show you want. It starts when you want to start it, and you're only watching the items that you want to watch. If something you don't like is on, you're not going to watch that thing. And so as we're becoming used to consuming media in this way, I think this is also analogous to the consuming of auditory media. So in terms of podcasts and things like this, we're all carrying our cell phones with us these days, which can be easy consumption devices for podcasts. And increasingly, these voice assistants are finding their way into more and more places. And so a big one that's becoming popular lately is also the car. So the car is one of the places where radio has been traditionally very popular. And now imagine that in the car, you can have this a la carte experience. You can dial up just the programming that you want to hear, start it on your own terms. So rather than if your commute starts, 15 minutes after the linear programming show would have begun, instead you can start right from the beginning of the show and you don't have to miss a beat. So I think this is one of the things, this pattern of media consumption that's changing is one of the things that's really helping the podcast industry. I think another thing that's nice about podcasts is that we sort of live in an age of multitasking. So in this age of Netflix that I said we're already in, when was the last time that you listened or that you watched rather a Netflix show while you didn't also occasionally check your cell phone or some other screen that you have with you? We're becoming more and more used to splitting our attention in these multitasking environments. And I think the audio format in particular is pretty good for that.
And particularly with podcasts, perhaps it's less of a guilty pleasure because, in a sense, the consumer doesn't have to feel that they're just passively consuming entertainment, but they're actually learning something. It's like reading a newspaper, getting information on something.
For sure, but it's also true that it's self-curated to your own interests, so that you've tuned into the things that really interest you, and so. It's, with the newspaper, if there are stories that you're not interested, maybe you're only interested in reading about business news. With podcasts in general, you're going to kind of more narrowly focus. It would be more akin to reading a magazine than to reading a newspaper, I think. Yeah. I think another reason for the popularity of these types of, voice-mediated communications, you kind of touched on a little bit. It's that voice is a very easy input compared to writing text. So like I use an Alexa device on my television, and it's much easier to search for a show just by saying the name of that show than it is to try to type it in on using the remote control.
Yes. The voice is perhaps the most natural and spontaneous means of communication, even with machines. Google founders admitted to having been inspired by the Star Trek computer in developing the usability of their products and devices. And of course, nowadays, as you've said, we address our cars in the same way Captains Kirk and Picard address the computer of the Enterprise. What role has artificial intelligence played in this development?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. So I think when people imagine interacting with computers, they think about artificial intelligence through the whole process, that they're interacting with an artificially intelligent entity. I think what's really closer to reality, however, is that where artificial intelligence thus far comes into the picture is in dealing with the challenges, the computer science challenges for understanding voice. So that mostly means understanding the natural language processing, understanding the natural language understanding. So as I've spoken something out loud, these are artificial intelligence is being used to understand the words that I said and the intent of these words perhaps from the context or perhaps from the way I said it. So the majority of voice interactions, even on these devices, are not in the sense that you're dealing with a artificially intelligent entity. It's more like, it's closer akin to like a regular computer program. So if a person says, this, then the response that you get is a pre-programmed to that.
Yes.
The majority of for example, the skills that are available on Amazon Alexa are more like this in nature. Now, there are some exceptions to that. So chatbots do use artificial intelligence in some cases to try to make conversations with people seem more natural. And there are also some exciting new developments that are coming down the line as well. So I've read about some, for example, like biometrics. Trying to do an ID by voice is one application. So a computer might be able to identify who I am simply by hearing my voice. I've heard about medical diagnosis for certain conditions by voice. And I've also, I don't know to the extent that these can be done live at this point, but I've also read about trying to infer things like emotions or mood states from the tone of my voice, which could be then used to adapt how the rest of the conversation unfolds.
Certainly. Podcast producers and hosts like myself could feel very deluded to read in your research that audio is not an especially effective way to convey information. Now, how did you arrive at that conclusion? And tell me it's not true.
Well, it's not true. Don't worry about it, David. There's actually, I think there's some good news on this front, to be frank with you. So in my research with Vicki Morwitz, who's a professor at Columbia University, we look at a very specific case. So as a marketing professor, I'm interested in this idea of voice commerce. How do we transact by voice? And as a starting point for this research, we were looking specifically at the context where we were presenting consumers with multiple options for what they could buy by voice. So in the case of the research that I've done so far, that means typically two options. So what we find is in a two-option choice context, this is a particular context that consumers find very difficult. They have a difficulty making these comparisons when the options are presented by voice. And so there are a couple consequences from this. The first of which is if one of these options is recommended, the consumers are likely to choose that recommended option. Conversely, at the same time, while they're more likely to accept a recommendation, they're also more likely to defer choice. That is, choose not to choose anything, maybe seek some other kind of medium to make their choice. So these are some consequences that occur as a result of this two-option choice. Now, we've looked at this also in contexts that are closer to what's happening in voice commerce today. So if you shop by voice today, typically what will happen is one option is offered to you, and then you'll be asked if you want to buy it. And so we've looked at some cases to try to understand what the process, why this two-option choice is so hard. And what we find is that when consumers need to consult their memory and compare the option to something they're holding in memory, this is when the option can be this process can be very difficult. So so for example, if you were comparing in our research we use a vitamin. So if you were comparing a vitamin and you were told beforehand that you need a certain amount of a vitamin in order to be effective, if you were told about a vitamin by voice, you'll have difficulty comparing the vitamin that's being described to you to that standard of reference that we had provided you before. Mm-hmm. This process is more difficult when the information is presented in an auditory way. And so then it leads you to be less sure of your evaluation of that product, and your evaluations will tend to be less extreme. So if the vitamin that we described to you, exceeds these minimum recommended doses or something like that, you wouldn't find it to be as favorable as you had if you had instead seen the information presented visually in written text.
There's a popular expression, seeing is believing, but there are those who manage to see things that are spoken, others who can't, and still others forget very quickly what they hear. What role does short-term memory play in our ability to process audio information?
Yeah, so that's another great question, and for me, this is at the heart of why these deficiencies occur. So to try to directly ask what the role of short-term memory was in this ability to process audio information, we brought consumers into a lab and we tested their memory ability for auditory stimuli. So we did this with what's called a digit span task. We played an audio file that contained a string of numbers, and we tested consumers' ability to remember these strings of numbers, starting with very short strings and then getting more and more digits, so we could really get a range, really understand how well people were memorizing these strings of numbers. And what we find is that as consumers' memory improves, their ability to perform on these choice tasks also improves. So these tendencies, these outcomes that I described earlier, the tendency to follow recommendations or to defer choice, these things become less likely as one's memory improves.
Would we be more likely to retain the content of a podcast by reading the transcript rather than listening to it?
So that's another great question. And this one has actually been described before. So I had sort of started getting to this answer when I was describing why there was good news for podcasts. So in this context of the two-option choice, in my research, there are deficiencies, but there's existing work that suggests for things like a podcast, the answer is sort of more of it depends. Mm-hmm. And so you might be wondering, well, what does it depend on? For a case like what we're doing right now, you and I are having a conversation. And because we're having a conversation, this is the natural medium of a conversation. We're having it by voice. It makes sense to consume it by voice. So there's a matching here between the medium and the content. Where transcripts can be, there is some existing research also that shows that instead auditory information can be harder to process. And this can be things that I think consistent with the research that I've demonstrated in the context of choice. These are the things that, consistent with the research that I described to you earlier, may rely more on memory. So you can imagine instead of being a podcast, which is a conversation like we're having right now, you can imagine instead like a lecture, something that's very dense with information, where consumers, or it wouldn't be consumers, I guess it would be students in this case, trying to learn as much as they can. The problem with this type of information is that sometimes, although I'm sure this is not true for my own lectures, sometimes these types of things can be rather dry. And in these cases, people's minds can wander. They can stop paying attention as fully as they should. And in the case
in the event of multitasking, as you mentioned.
Yeah, also that as well. But if people lose kind of their train of thought, and they're not paying as fully attention, there's a disadvantage to audio in that you can't go back as easily. It's a linear format where one can't revisit the part where they tuned out. So that's a real advantage for written text. And so when they test these very dense types of content, the typical finding is that there's a slight advantage for the written words over, for example, a podcast or audio content.
Kurt, you've mentioned voice commerce, shopping by voice. Companies are using voice in many ways, starting with branded podcasts. Do you believe it's possible to convey brand positioning via audio?
This is a question that's particularly interesting to me because lots of companies are trying to develop their own voice assistants. Mm-hmm. So this is particularly true in the space of automobiles, where say, for example, BMW were trying to develop their own voice assistant. The question for use when you're in a BMW, the question is then, what should a BMW sound like? And I don't think it's as an easy question as you might guess, because we know that there are personality traits for people. And so in some sense, this digital voice that represents BMW is going to have these human personality traits. And then there's also research suggesting that there are distinct personality traits that brands typically exhibit. And then, so understanding all of this and trying to understand what is it about a voice that conveys all of these different personality traits, I think is going to be a challenging question. because there is information about the voice itself. So you could imagine there's the pitch, the gender, the rate of speech. All of these things are more easy to quantify. But then there's also the less tangible things, less easy to quantify. So, if you work as a voice actor, how many times have you had to kind of ad lib on a script that you're reading because it's clear that the character would never say it in that way? You have to kind of change it. So you have to have a content, I think, that goes along with the character that you're trying to convey. And you also have to decide how to say it. And I don't know that we're quite there yet with the artificial intelligence, so to speak, in terms of how we can present this artificial text. But it's going to be an exciting road to go down in the future, I think.
In the early 1930s and 40s, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt developed great rapport with the citizens of his country through his series of evening radio addresses called fireside chats that brought the president right into people's homes. Well over a half century later, these podcasts are most often followed on personal devices, as you've said, through personal earphones. How would you compare listening to a podcast to listening to a traditional radio show?
Yeah, so this goes beyond the literature that I'm aware of, so I'm going to be speculating here a bit as well. But I do know there's a couple questions that I think are interesting here. So earlier you asked me, why Clubhouse? It's possible that people are looking, because they're also getting used to interacting with their devices. It's become more of a bidirectional, interactive, two-way communication environment that they're starting to also look for this from podcasts, which to me is kind of what Clubhouse sort of is. It's listening to a live version of a podcast where you can also potentially make your own comments if that's something you want, if you wanted to say. I think the jury is still out as to whether or not things like Clubhouse will be, ultimately will stand the test of time as something that consumers continue to participate in. But we'll see. I think, conversely, I think podcasting, for all the reasons that I talked about earlier, is something that consumers are embracing. That it's on demand. It's, you're in control of the audio to a greater extent. And I've heard anecdotally also, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts of this. People seem to feel more closely connected to the host of podcasts compared to some other media. So for example, you feel more like a friend when it's on a podcast for some reason compared to even like a talk radio or a television show. So these are just anecdotes that I've heard from people. I don't know that this is empirically, if one would be able to demonstrate this empirically, but I think it's an interesting phenomenon to kind of follow up on. Have you had that experience where people that you don't know who have heard your voice in a podcast feel like they're friends with you?
I think in general, if people see you on television or hear you, they can get that sense. But I think what you're saying is fascinating, that people could feel closer if they only hear them. Like I'm thinking of my relationship with Michael Barbaro of the New York Times podcast and Oprah Winfrey on television. Yes, I guess seeing Oprah up on the screen makes her feel more at a distance. I mean, Michael has kind of always just existed in my head. So that sounds like an interesting corner of research.
Yeah, so it could be off the cuff. I could think, when you see a person, it's clear that they're not talking to you. There's usually somebody sitting next to them that they're talking with, having a conversation with. Whereas it's easier to imagine, to transport yourself into the narrative when you're just hearing the voice. It feels more like a conversation that you're having, like we're having right now. You can imagine that listeners to this conversation might feel more like participants compared to maybe some other media. It's certainly an interesting hypothesis at any rate. Another part of your question was about, I think you asked about whether, the headphones kind of made a difference.
Exactly.
There is some information, there's some very new, and I don't think it's been published yet, so I don't know if it has survived peer review or not, that looked at this question of whether headphones makes a difference. So if you were listening to this podcast to being broadcast into the room versus hearing the same podcast over your headset, plugged into your ears, it's possible that this does have an effect also on making you feel closer to the person. I think I wasn't able to read a copy of it because it's not available, it's not published yet, but I had seen this presented at a conference, and this was along the lines of what they were arguing. I will say, though, with the caveat that it's difficult to make this comparison of broadcasting into the room versus broadcasting into your ears. It's difficult to make these two environments identical. So it could just be the case that it's easier you actually have better sound quality in your headset. And we know that from other research that the sound quality matters a lot in terms of your liking for the material. And so these things could also have an effect independent of this feeling of closeness.
Kurt, bear with me as I take you perhaps down another rabbit hole. Although it does happen, I've rarely seen a movie based on a novel that is as good as the novel I've read. And I'm convinced that this is because the world I create in my head is often much richer and more detailed than what a director or a production team can or have the money to come up with. Could it also be true with simply hearing people speak rather than seeing them, as you touched on? Could the David and Kurt, our listeners, have conjured in their minds during this podcast possibly be even more stunning and fascinating than we actually are? Oh,
for sure. I'm also taller in audio, so at least in the mind of the listeners, right? So there's some interesting research that I think can potentially speak to this question a little bit. We know that when people are kind of missing information, they often fill in the missing information with like an idealized version of that information. So if you could imagine going to a baseball game, or since we're in Europe, we'll say a soccer game. Typically when you imagine going to what kind of image came to your mind as I described that? I think if you're like most people, the image was of like a nice sunny day where the weather's nice, it's comfortable, you're with friends. Whatever team you're rooting for has scored early and often, and the other team has been completely shut out, and it's a wonderful day. Whereas in reality, we know that the home team doesn't always win, and it's not always a sunny day. But for whatever reason, when we try to imagine these things in our head, we fill in the best possible version of that. And I think it certainly seems at least plausible to me that could happen in the case for these stories. When things are described to you, you probably need to fill in a lot of the details to make it possible. You need to fill in lots of the details in order to really have a full understanding of the scene that's being laid. And you probably do it in a way where you're not constrained at all, and you can kind of fill in with whatever details you want. Whereas when you start to see something in a movie, a lot of those, there are constraints. Instead of being limitless in how I see, Dumbledore, I have to see the choice that the director made in, adapting the book to the movie.
Yes.
I don't know that anyone has looked at this, looking at the comparison that you were talking about. So comparing the text to the audio. And I think it's an interesting question because I think it could potentially, you could kind of see both things potentially happening, that people, by hearing voices, are somewhat constrained in their reality of what it could be compared to text. But on the other hand, we talked earlier that there's so much more information that's available in audio that they may have used this additional information as scaffolding for, all new types of creativity that weren't even possible when they were just reading the, black and white text on the page.
Yes. Well, Kurt, I've enjoyed this conversation with you, and I want to thank you so much for your time, your curiosity, and your candor.
David, I've really enjoyed the podcast.
I'm David Wayne Callahan, and this has been Clarity in a Messy World, a podcast from Bocconi University, Milan. Thanks for listening. You can find references from this episode in the podcast notes. To be notified when new episodes come up, subscribe to Clarity on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or Spreaker.